Hello, I wanted to start this video off by showing you where I have the questions pulled up on my computer screen. I just wanted to be able to answer them and read them off and answer just each part of them. But I'm starting off with question number 1, explaining how industrialization changed America. It changed America in the way that it transformed our society. It was post-Civil War, so a lot of people were trying to gain success and almost make a new beginning for themselves. So this made people move to bigger cities where factories were and be able to gain more jobs. It's also brought immigrants in because they were also looking for bigger opportunities for themselves. So when people were moving to these bigger cities, it was becoming overcrowded for them, which led to a lot of people working at those factories. They were experiencing really bad work conditions and having to work really long hours. This included child labor and all sorts of bad things for them at the time. So as so many people were moving to these cities, it was giving the business owners a lot of power. So as they were growing in power, people were growing in poverty. A lot of the immigrants that were moving in were also experiencing those really bad work conditions and being discriminated against at the same time. The immigrants included, they were also experiencing very bad housing conditions. There was a lot of problems in the world that people were starting to notice and voice. The relationship between powerful corporations and the federal government was almost like they were tied together. They were friends, backing up each other against the workers or the poverty. And in my point of view, that's how it has always seemed to me. One example of this could be the Pullman strike in 1894. The president at the time, President Grover Cleveland, he sent troops to break up the strike, which was favoring the rail companies. In my head, they're just money hungry, and they're supporting the people that are making money for them at the time, which is crazy to me also because it's like it's the workers that are making the whole thing happen. But since the big powerful leaders such as like Carnegie and Rockefeller that were gaining so much power at the time, they were seen as the money makers, even though the workers are the one who are putting in the hard work and everything such as that. There was just a lot of tension in the world at the time between the workers, the wealthy, and the government. It just seemed like at the time the whole world was full of tension, and a lot of those strikes that were happening at the time was proof of that, including the way that the powerful corporations and the federal government were siding with each other. Like the railroad, steel, and oil that were expanding really fast, the government was siding with those business leaders. The second question that I chose was number 2. Think about immigration, the Indian problem, and imperialism. I forgot. So on number 1, one of the evidence that I chose, not the evidence, but one of the parts of the readings from perusal that I chose to back up my point was on lesson 1 on perusal. It says on the end of the page on part 1, it said the extremely hard times and poverty that many workers faced led to the rise of anti-capitalist movements like socialism and anarchy. Labor strikes became more common and heated as workers fought back in the only way they could. Their efforts were usually unsuccessful, which led to more opposition against capitalism and government. So that's just another way to prove that the government was almost against the workers in a way. Like as they were trying to fight for their rights, the government just kind of shot them down. So the second question that I chose was number 2, think about immigration, the Indian problem, and imperialism. What did all these issues have in common? They had in common that a lot of people at the time in America thought of people coming from immigration and imperialism, they thought of them as less than. A lot of people had a racist mindset at the time, so they just thought that they were less than, they thought that they were dumb in a way, and as what were white Americans concerned about with these groups of people. So they were concerned that they were dumb, like I said, and they were concerned that they were just not adopting to their ways. So whenever they were coming in, they wanted them to just adopt their ways. They didn't want to accept their culture. They didn't want to accept their ways at all. Whenever they came in, they wanted them to adopt the American way and go by what they said. And they said that if they didn't go by their way, that they were viewed as almost like rebels in a way. And what attitudes were held by many Americans about these foreign natives, they just didn't look at them like they belonged. They just were not very favorable of them coming in. And it kind of relates to my last question that I chose, is the progressive movement, that even if people of that progressive movement, where they were looking for fairness, they were even almost upset with like the immigrants coming in because they felt like they were being overcrowded again. They were just not very favorable of it. What ideas were implemented to Americanize these groups of people? These ideas included the schools really just teaching about English and just teaching about American history. And like I said, they were bringing in the immigrants that were coming in. They were really just wanting them to adopt their ways. So whenever they were bringing children into these certain schools, they were only teaching them the American ways. They still believed at the time that white Americans were superior against any other race, and they were really just seen as challenges to America at the time. One passage that I chose to choose from one of the perusal readings was from lesson 2 for this. I felt like this passage really backed what I was saying. It says, Native American civilizations were seen as primitive and destined to die away as progress spread through the continent. The idea of progress included spreading Christianity, which is of their religion, the English language, industry, and the production of cash crops to be sold in distant markets. The forceful spread of white settlers into Native American lands inevitably led to conflict. From the end of the Civil War to 1890, the American military launched a series of wars against Native Americans, which are collectively referred to as the Indian Wars. People were just not accepting of them at all, and they did not want to bring their own culture in. It seemed like they really didn't want any difference in the world. They all wanted them to be all white Americans, and they all wanted to believe in the same thing, and just in their mind to not lead to any conflict, which was unrealistic. The last question I chose was number 5. What was the progressive movement all about? I like choosing this question because it really related to number 1 about industrialization, because industrialization was such a big factor in the progressive movement. So because the problems of the industrialization is what the progressive movement was all about. The factors of the unsafe work conditions, women's rights, the long hours of child labor, all of those problems, they all led to the progressive movement because people were gaining voice and they were really making things happen at the time. They wanted to solve the problem of, they wanted to solve the problems of bad work conditions, of child labor. They wanted to give women more rights. They wanted to just create more fairness in the world, and they wanted to hold people accountable. How did they go about solving these problems? There was a lot of strikes, such as the strikes that I described in my first question about the Pullman strike. Also, in the more fairness that they were trying to create for the world or in the country was the fairness for people in the working conditions, and they were fighting for people to be more healthy in the way of healthcare, and they wanted set rules on food, such as like the health code violations we have today. Thank God that we have that now. They were worried about people in poverty as well. They were just asking for help for those. They had a more democratic mindset at the time, which is very interesting to look back at too, because reading about how a lot of the people of the progressive movement, they still believed in the white Americans being superior against the other races, which is very interesting. Just read it like today because of how the Democratic Party has transformed into being very accepting of that. It's just very interesting to read how our world has transformed so much, and each group has transformed so much. Another question from here: how did they go about solving these problems, the strikes, and just using their voice, such as journalists, campaigns? They were pushing for laws, and a lot of this also played into the fact, the last question about how Theodore Roosevelt fit into this movement. Theodore Roosevelt played a big role in this movement. He was known as the progressive president. He was making a lot of all the things that the people were pushing for at the moment, he was putting them into place, such as the 19th and 17th Amendment. The people were just pushing for more power over the leaders and the really successful leaders of the businesses. Less political corruption ended up happening. So those are the things that they were really successful in. I would say that the progressive movement was overall successful. And then the things that they were not successful in is ignoring racial inequality. Like I said, the people at the time were not as passionate about equality throughout all the races. And the dangerous work site, they ended up continuing majority-wise. And the ban on alcohol that they were really pushing for at the time, it really just backfired, and so they ended up redoing that. But that's about all I have. Thank you.